hurrow! Oh, hurrow! I'm sorry for being racist. Anyway, as you can see from the little title card that I've made here, this video is about whether it even makes sense that there could be an opposite dimension, even if we, even if there are dimensions, doesn't make sense that there's an opposite dimension. So, yeah, this is part 3. This is going to be the conclusion. Hopefully, the extra cognitive load of drawing pictures for this video doesn't make it harder to actually make the video. Actually, you know what? There we go. I improved it. Anyway, I'm just going to sit here for a few seconds. So then this shows up as the thumbnail. Okay, there we go. So I think we're ready to start up. I think we're ready to start. So here, we're going to talk about the opposite dimension. Now, what is the opposite? What is the opposite dimension? Well, the opposite dimension is the dimension in which everything is the opposite of the way it is in our dimension. Now, that makes sense, right? So, let's suppose that we live in a, let's suppose that our universe is part of an infinite multiverse, right? With all these different universes, with all these different dimensions within it. Now we're gonna say like our dimension is this little yellow one right here because I'm racist, and this little thing, and this little blue dimension over here is the opposite dimension because blue is the opposite color from yellow. So yeah, does that make sense? All right. Okay, so let's say that since there is an opposite, since there is an opposite dimension, so let's say that here we have on the left we have our normal, we have our home dimension, and on the right we have our opposite dimension. So in our home dimension, in our home dimension, hang on, let me change my font to something that you might like better. If the font list will show. Oh, come on, Microsoft, really? Why can't Microsoft just make good responsive font lists? Like, what the heck is up with Microsoft and listing fonts that take so long? Especially on Mac, it takes extremely long on Mac to list to just generate the font list. Okay, but anyway, I'm gonna pick a more attractive font like this one. This is actually, I think this might actually be the font that's in Undertale. It's called Fixed SYS. I think it's called that because it's fixed width and it's also system font or something. I don't know. But anyway. Sorry. We're going to list some rules for each dimension. So we're going to list some rules for our home dimension. So, oh yeah, right, it has to be yellow since it's our home dimension. So in our home dimension, we cannot access the opposite dimension. Now that makes sense, right? Because there's no way that, at least that we know of, to access or prove the existence of the opposite dimension. So that means that in the opposite dimension, we can access the same dimension. Now, that because can is the opposite of cannot. Except that I wrote that. We need everything to be the opposite of itself. So we're going to put you can not access the same dimension. Yeah, there we go. This doesn't make sense because you are constantly in whatever dimension you are in. But that is the rule that is a rule of our dimension. You are in the dimension you are in, and yeah, that makes sense because you are in the dimension you are in, because we are in our normal non-opposite dimension. So that means that in the opposite dimension, that is to say that in the opposite dimension, I am outside the dimension I am outside of. Now, wait a second. These are the same thing. So that means that actually we can't just reverse every phrase within a sentence. We can't just reverse all the meanings within a sentence. We need to actually reverse only the meaning of the sentence as a whole, and not like just every little bit of the sentence, because that doesn't make sense, because then we just end up with the same thing. Because like if you say, I ain't got no chicken nuggets, that means you do have chicken nuggets, because you do not have chicken nuggets. Does that make sense? So that means that we actually have to put you are not in the dimension you are in. Because if we put you are not in the dimension you are not in, that doesn't make sense, because that's the same thing, and that wouldn't be the opposite, right? So since we have these two rules here, let's go for some more. Let's go out on a limb here and just make the assumption that whoever's watching this, let's go ahead and make the assumption that whoever you are watching this, you exist. Now, what is the opposite of existence? So the opposite of existence is non-existence. So that means that in the opposite dimension, you do not exist. So if you do not exist in the opposite dimension, that means that you are actually, it's not like you're a boy instead of a girl, or you you live in Antarctica instead of the North Pole, which Santa Claus, if you're watching this, why are you watching this? How are you watching this? How do you get such good internet service? Do you have good internet service? I don't like Comcast, Santa Claus, please help me. Okay, anyway. Next up, we're going to go to our next thing. So, in the opposite dimension, you do not exist, right? But in our dimension, you have a property. Example, you are smart. So, if you have a property such as being smart in the opposite dimension, then we can say you have a property, you are idiotic. Now, this does not make sense, because idiotic in the opposite dimension is smart, which that doesn't make sense, right? So, but if you aren't in the opposite dimension and you are in this dimension, but you have to also be idiotic in the opposite dimension while also not existing in the opposite dimension, how can we fix that? So we're gonna say that we're gonna represent neutral rules as whatever the average is of. Oh wait, that's literally gray. So we're gonna represent neutral rules as being gray. So we're gonna put we're gonna put another rule here. Because of this, you in the case of the opposite dimension refers to you in this dimension, because in the opposite dimension, then opposite cannot be the same, because otherwise there is no opposite dimension, which means our dimension does not exist. And since our dimension does exist, then we have to make an exception for the opposite dimension being for literally opposites in the opposite dimension, because like the opposite of opposite is opposite. So because, for example, so so like in the opposite dimension, it's not, so like we have this red circle and it is opposite this green circle, and in the opposite dimension, the red circle, then it's still the same relationship. It's just in a different direction. So so instead of the red circle being opposite the green circle is opposite the red circle. Stop texting me when I'm in school. Oh, right, I forgot. I forgot that I got out of school early. Anyway, we're going to keep writing now. So that means that you, because we can replace you over here with you in this dimension, which means we can replace you over here with you in the other dimension, which means that we don't really have any problems there. So, in our dimension, so that means that because you in this dimension are smart and you in this dimension in the opposite dimension are idiotic, you in this dimension, as this dimension is the opposite dimension of the opposite dimension, must also be idiotic and smart at the same time. Now, actually, this makes plenty of sense. This actually makes plenty of sense because, actually, let's just say something about reality here. People, as a result, this actually aligns perfectly with reality. People in our dimension do both extremely like that. That's an extremely dumb thing. Extremely dumb things, such as typing extremely and extremely smart things, like intentionally typing extremely for comedic effect. Now, this is actually really interesting because that's incredibly realistic. That people, yeah, this is actually something that we can prove is true, which means that either people intrinsically have qualities of both smartness and dumbness to them in our just self-contained in our dimension, or the opposite dimension is real. So, I was actually trying to disprove the existence of the opposite dimension, but it seems like we're actually proving that it exists accidentally. So, I guess we're going to clear the screen here. Actually, no, cleaning the screen is dumb. Clearing the screen is dumb. We're going to do this instead. We're literally just going to extend it like this. I know, it's a very epic solution to the problem of running out of space. So here we go. Now we have our extended portion of the screen so that we can scroll down and continue writing things. So let's continue. In our dimension, the opposite dimension, okay, so we know in our dimension to be true that the opposite dimension is the opposite of this dimension because it is the opposite dimension. Now, in the opposite dimension, then we actually don't. Then in the opposite dimension, the opposite must be true because it's the opposite dimension. So the opposite dimension is not the opposite of this dimension because it is not because it is the opposite dimension. You know, that seems like the most logical way to reverse that sentence. Oh my gosh, yes, I love when lines end on the same pixel. It's just I love when two lines end on the same pixel. It's just so satisfying to look at. Anyway. This actually gives more credibility to what we had earlier, where we made the exception because we made the exception earlier about opposite not meaning the same in the opposite dimension, because then there wouldn't be an opposite dimension in the opposite dimension, which would make our dimension not exist, and we know we exist. So yeah, and because of the opposite dimension being the opposite dimension of this dimension, then the opposite dimension of the opposite dimension is not the opposite dimension of the opposite dimension, not because it is the opposite dimension of the opposite dimension. What? Okay, you know, this is getting confusing, but I hope you can stick with me for a little bit more. What the heck? I've been rambling for like 17 minutes. Wow. I should really end this video in at the 20-minute mark. Anyway, we're almost done here. So we're gonna do something dumb. We're gonna write something really that is just universally true throughout our dimension. So in our dimension, puppies are cute. Now, since that is true in our dimension, then either that means that in the opposite dimension, that either means that we can reverse that in two different ways. That either means that in the opposite dimension, kittens are cute, or that in the opposite dimension, puppies are ugly. Now, we already know that in our dimension, kittens are cute, and also that puppies are not ugly, except for pugs. You know what? Puppies are both ugly and cute. So puppies can be both ugly and cute, and ugly cute. So that means that in the opposite dimension, puppies are cute, puppies are ugly, and cats are cute. But in our dimension, cats are also cute. Cats are also cute, which means that in the opposite dimension, which means that in the opposite dimension, puppies are cute and cats are ugly. Wait, no. That means that cats are ugly and puppies are cute. Now, if you look at these two statements, these two statements are actually both true in our dimension and in the opposite dimension. So that means that because of this, that means that some things are actually the same between the opposite dimension and the non-opposite dimension, because some things have two different opposites. Now, in our dimension, we have red. We have red in our dimension, okay? So since we have red in our dimension, that means that in the opposite dimension, that means that the opposite dimension has sea green. Now now our dimension has red and the opposite dimension has sea green. But our dimension also has sea green, and the opposite dimension, I wouldn't doubt that it has red as well. So what's up with this? Now if you keep doing this, you'll realize that actually you will realize that actually the majority of statements are made up of different parts with different with their own opposites. Now from this statement, we can actually conclude that we are actually living in the opposite dimension, and the opposite dimension is actually one with the non-opposite dimension, and they are not separate. They are actually the same dimension, which is likely why we experience the Mandela effect, except for that is actually not why the Mandela effect happens, but who freaking cares? That could be an explanation of it, assuming that there is an opposite dimension in the first place. So what have we learned today? We have learned today that in a world where there is an opposite dimension, the non-opposite dimension is actually then the main dimension. Then any dimension is actually composed of itself and its opposite dimension, and they are one and the same. Now this means that because the opposite dimension is the same thing as because any dimension is its own opposite dimension, then there is no opposite dimension. Now, because there is no opposite dimension, as a result of there being an opposite dimension in the first place, we can conclude that there is no opposite dimension. And in the opposite dimension, Blaine did not lie about actually ending his video at the 20-minute mark, because this is the opposite dimension. But if this is the opposite dimension, then there is no opposite dimension, which means we don't exist. But what's up with that? Like, clearly we exist, right? I mean, I know we exist, because if we didn't exist, I wouldn't be making this video, XD. Because okay, so let's say that we have a fictional character, such as, I don't know, let's say, okay, so let's create a fictional character here, called, I don't know, Steve. So we have our little stickman. You know what? I don't feel like making stickman. I don't feel like making a stickman. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this instead because I'm stupid. I'm gonna do this instead because I'm stupid. Instead of making a stickman. So then we have our fictional character named Steve. Now, since Steve is fictional, we can say anything about Steve. We can say that his birthday's today. We can say, anything about Steve and it becomes true. We can say his birthday's today. We can say that, he has a broken leg. And, we aren't wrong because he isn't actually real. Now, since Steve isn't actually real, then we can say pretty much anything we want about him and not be wrong. But none of these things are actually true, even though we aren't wrong about them, because Steve isn't real. And so Steve doesn't really have his own experiences, but we do have our own experiences, which means that we exist. So that means that, in conclusion, there was no opposite dimension in the first place, even though there is an opposite dimension. I know that doesn't make sense, but various things in life are paradoxical on their own. I mean, I can't really think of anything on my own, which is, yeah, right there. That right now, I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head, which means I'm probably wrong. But, I mean, I'm not wrong though. That's a paradox, and nothing happened. We still exist, and nothing has happened. Is that the garbage truck out there? Are you trying to call my video garbage? You